Lana pressed the headphones against her ears, her breath hitching as the digital display on her tablet spiked into jagged, impossible patterns. She had come to these mountains to record the high-pitched clicks of bats. But the sensors were feeding her something that shouldn't exist. A chorus of rhythmic, subterranean whispers rising from the deep limestone. Through the static, a voice, hollow, rasping, and decades cold, pronounced her name with a clarity that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. A sudden, violent thud rocked the research trailer, sending her equipment crashing to the floor. Outside, the pitch-black Appalachian woods were no longer silent. The blinding glare of high beams cut through the fog, and the heavy thrum of idling engines vibrated in the soles of her boots. As a jagged stone shattered the window, spraying glass across her monitors, Lana realized the sensors weren't just picking up the ghosts of the dead. The living were already at her door, and they were coming to make sure the mountain's secrets stayed buried. Lana McCoy stepped out into the thick, humid air of the Appalachian dusk. The weight of the equipment case in her right hand, pulling her shoulder taut. It was a familiar ache, one that matched the rhythmic thrum of insects vibrating in the undergrowth. Here were the mountains of eastern Kentucky folded into deep, shadowed pleats. The air always smelled of damp earth and rotting pine needles, a scent that clung to her fleece jacket like a memory she couldn't quite shake. She moved with a practiced, hurried grace, her boots finding purchase on the slick carpet of leaves. There was no time to waste. The bats would be emerging soon, and the acoustic sensors needed to be positioned before the first leathery wings cut through the canopy. She reached the stand of ancient oaks she'd marked on her GPS, their bark rough and corrugated under her fingertips. With the precision of a surgeon, Lana began extracting the high-sensitivity microphones from their foam-lined housing. Metal clips snapped shut with satisfying, hollow clicks as she secured the sensors to the trunks, ensuring the diaphragms faced the open corridors of the forest where the ultrasound pulses would be clearest. Her fingers, scarred by years of fieldwork and nicks from briars, moved instinctively. She didn't need to think about the settings anymore. The frequency ranges were etched into her mind. As she glanced at her tablet, the screen's glow casting a spectral blue light across her sharp features. She saw the purple shadows of the mountains deepening. This was her world. A world of data, of decibels and hertz. A shield of science she used to protect herself from the messy, jagged history of the soil beneath her feet. The silence of the woods was suddenly shattered by the aggressive roar of a distant engine. Lana didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sound grew, a mechanical growl that vibrated in the marrow of her bones, until a battered, mud-caked pickup truck tore around the bend, its tires spitting gravel into the air. The dust cloud was thick, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with the bitter taste of limestone. Silas Varney didn't bother killing the engine. He vaulted from the cab before the truck had even fully stopped, his presence instantly consuming the small clearing. He was a man built of iron and spite, his face a roadmap of broken capillaries and deep-set grudges. He marched toward her, his heavy work boots crushing the delicate ferns she'd been careful to avoid. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could smell the stale whiskey and tobacco clinging to his flannel shirt. His shadow, elongated by the setting sun, draped over her equipment like a shroud. "You're still here," Varney said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like stones grinding together in a riverbed. He didn't ask. He accused. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the delicate microphones. "I told you, McCoy. This land is for people who work, not for girls playing with expensive toys. You're interfering with legitimate business. We've got coal to move, and your little winged rats aren't going to stop the permits." Lana stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt the heat radiating from him, a physical manifestation of his rage. The bats are a protected species, Silas, and this is a federally funded study. You touch this equipment, and it's a felony. Varney's jaw tightened, a vein in his thick neck pulsing rhythmically. He leaned in closer, his eyes like dark, unblinking beads. Federal funding don't mean much when the mountain decides to move. You think those degrees make you smart? They just made you forget where you came from. Pack it up. Go back to your university before you find out just how unfriendly these hills can get for a McCoy who doesn't know when to leave well enough alone. He didn't wait for a reply. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near her boot, turned on his heel, and climbed back into the truck. The tires spun, kicking up a fresh wave of grit that pelted Lana's legs as he sped away, leaving her alone in the settling gloom. She tried to shake off the encounter, focusing on the equipment, but the peace of the forest felt fractured. As she moved to the next site, a strange sensation crept up through the soles of her boots. It wasn't the vibration of a truck this time. It was deeper, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. She froze, her breath hitching. The ground began to shudder, not a violent quake, but a rhythmic, mechanical pulsing, as if a giant heart were beating miles beneath the surface. Lana knelt, pressing her palm to the forest floor. The moss was cool and damp, but the tremors beneath it were unmistakable. It felt like a piston, steady and cold. Around her, the forest went deathly silent. The cicadas cut their song short. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. There was only that thrum, a sound from the abyss. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the back of her neck. She stood and hurried toward her last monitoring station, the beam of her flashlight dancing erratically over the trees. When she reached the site, her stomach dropped. The expensive microphones weren't just gone. They were slaughtered. The cables hung from the branches, like the entrails of a dead animal, and the plastic housings had been smashed into a jagged mulch of circuitry and glass, ground into the mud by something heavy and relentless. She picked up a fragment of a lens, the sharp edge drawing a thin line of red across her thumb. She didn't feel the sting, only the rising tide of fury. This wasn't just vandalism. It was an execution. She scanned the wall of green surrounding her, but the woods remained a silent, mocking witness. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, settled over her like a heavy, wet blanket. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed instantly by the crack of a stone hitting the oak tree inches from her ear. Shards of bark sprayed her cheek. Lana ducked, her pulse spiking. Another stone caught her on the shoulder, a blunt, agonizing impact that sent a jolt of white-hot pain down her arm. "Hey!" she screamed into the darkness. But the only response was the rustle of someone or something moving through the thick mountain laurel. More stones followed, launched with terrifying accuracy. She didn't stay to see who was throwing them. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on tree roots, her lungs burning as she gulped the humid air. The darkness seemed to thicken, the trees closing in like the bars of a cage. She burst into her small camp, her fingers fumbling with the latch of her research trailer. She fell inside, slamming the door and sliding the heavy steel bolt home just as another rock dented the exterior siding with a sickening metallic clang. Inside the cramped trailer, the air was stale, smelling of ozone from the equipment and the dregs of a cold cup of coffee. Lana slumped into her chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her shoulder throbbed, but she ignored it, her hands shaking as she reached for the keyboard. She needed to know what the sensors had caught before they were destroyed. She initiated the data recovery from the remote servers, her eyes fixed on the progress bar. When the files finally loaded, she slid on her heavy noise-canceling headphones. desperate to drown out the sound of the wind buffeting the trailer. She expected to see the sharp, clean spikes of bad echolocation. Instead, the screen filled with dense, chaotic bands of low-frequency noise. She frowned, adjusting the filters. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the hum of the earth she'd felt earlier. As she increased the gain, a sound filled her ears that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was a whisper. No, 1,000 whispers. A layered, overlapping cacophony of voices, shifting and murmuring without pause. It wasn't human, yet it possessed the cadence of speech. The sound seemed to resonate with the rhythm of her own heart, a sickening synchronization that made her dizzy. She pushed the filters to their limit, trying to isolate the sound, and the murmurs gave way to a deep, visceral groan. It was the sound of the mountain itself breathing, a tectonic sigh that felt ancient and full of grief. But then, through the static and the groan of the earth, a name cut through. Elijah. Lana ripped the headphones off, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. The name echoed in the silence of the trailer. Elijah McCoy, her grandfather. The man who had disappeared into the mines 50 years ago and never come out. She looked at the monitor, the sound waves dancing in patterns that felt disturbingly familiar, like the jagged lines of a family tree drawn in static. Suddenly, the interior of the trailer was flooded with a blinding, artificial light. Powerful halogen beams cut through the thin curtains, turning the space into a stark, white box. Outside, the peace was shattered by the synchronized blare of multiple car horns, a jagged, mocking symphony. Lana peered through a gap in the curtain. Varney's men were there, their trucks circling her trailer like sharks around a wounded whale. The engines revved, the vibration shaking the very walls of her sanctuary. She looked back at the screen, at the digital ghost of her grandfather's name, and then out at the men trying to drive her into the night. The fear that had been paralyzing her began to transmute into something harder, something colder. She wasn't just a biologist anymore. She was a McCoy, and the mountain was finally talking to her. She didn't wait for them to break down her door. She grabbed her jacket and her portable recorder, her fingers brushing against her grandfather's old watch in her pocket. The broken relic she always carried. The whispers from the headphones seemed to linger in the corners of the room, urging her forward. She killed the lights, letting the darkness of the trailer swallow her, and prepared to step out into the storm. The transition from the trailer to the world outside was a plunge into chaos. The roar of Varney's trucks was a physical weight, but she moved through the shadows with the stealth of the creatures she studied. She didn't head for her truck. She knew the road would be watched. Instead, she slipped into the tree line, the forest welcoming her back into its dark, wet embrace. The next morning brought no relief, only a different kind of cold. Lana sat hunched over her laptop in the gray light of dawn, the screen flickering with a new, devastating reality. An email from the university sat open, the official seal of the Board of Regents looking like a death warrant. Funding terminated, all field permits revoked. Return all university property immediately. The words blurred before her eyes. They'd gotten to the department. Varney or someone higher up had pulled the strings, and now she was a ghost in the system. No grant, no legal protection, no reason to stay. Except for the voices in the dirt. A massive mechanical groan pulled her attention back to the window. A yellow bulldozer, looking like a prehistoric beast, was grinding its way toward the entrance of her site. Silas Varney sat in the cab, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. With a casual flick of the controls, he sent the massive blade into a young pine, snapping it like a toothpick. He wasn't clearing land. He was building a wall. He pushed a mountain of gravel and uprooted stumps across the only access road, effectively entombing her truck and her trailer in the small hollow. He killed the engine, stepped down, and looked toward her trailer with a slow, predatory grin before pocketing the keys. The night that followed was the color of fire. Lana was startled from a fitful sleep by the sound of shattering glass. A Molotov cocktail, crude and effective, burst through the front window of the trailer. Orange flames licked at the ceiling, the smell of burning plastic and gasoline instantly thick enough to choke on. She scrambled for her bag, her fingers screaming as she grabbed the hard drives containing her data. "Get out! Get out!" she coughed, the heat singing her hair. She burst through the door just as a second bottle hit the side of the trailer, turning her home into a pyre. She didn't look back. She ran into the woods, the thorns of the blackberry bushes tearing at her skin, the heavy breathing of Varney's men echoing behind her. Their flashlights danced through the trees like malevolent fireflies. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, her feet sliding on the slick mud of a steep ravine. And then, the earth opened up. She pushed through a wall of wet ferns and found herself standing before a dark, jagged maw in the mountainside. It was a mine entrance, old and forgotten, its timbers rotted to the color of bone. A rusted iron grate lay cast aside, half buried in the silt. Without a second thought, she stepped into the cold, damp darkness. The smells of iron and old death rising to meet her. The air inside the mine was heavy, a thick soup of moisture and ancient dust. Her flashlight beam was a weak, flickering thing against the absolute black. She moved deeper, her hand brushing against a rusted metal box bolted to the wall. Her fingers caught on the latch, and it swung open with a scream of tortured metal. Inside, resting on a bed of rotted rags, was a silver object. She picked it up. It was a watch, a heavy, silver chronometer. She wiped the grime from the back and felt her heart stop. E.M. Elijah McCoy. The metal was ice cold, but it felt like it was burning her palm. As she stood there, a gray mist began to curl around her feet, smelling of sulfur and wet stone. The walls of the mine seemed to soften, the solid rock rippling like water in her peripheral vision. The support beams groaned, bending at impossible angles, taking on the appearance of a rib cage. The hallucinations hit her in waves, distortions of light and sound that made her knees buckle. Shadows detached themselves from the walls. Tall, faceless figures, darker than the surrounding gloom, began to circle her. They didn't speak, but the air vibrated with their presence, a low-frequency hum that made her teeth ache. She backed away, but the tunnels seemed to stretch and contract, a stone throat trying to swallow her whole. Underneath a pile of tattered canvas, she found it. A leather satchel, remarkably preserved by the dry air of the deeper shaft. Inside were the ledgers. She scanned the pages, her flashlight trembling. Lower levels sealed. 14th of May. Cost of rescue exceeds projected quarterly earnings. Seal the vents. Report as accidental collapse. The names were all there. Her grandfather, her uncles, neighbors, friends. A whole generation of the Hollow, buried alive to save a few dollars on a balance sheet. The Varney name was at the bottom of every page, a jagged signature that looked like a scar. The shadows closed in, their eyeless heads tilting in unison. Lana turned to run, her boots slipping on the rotted floorboards. She didn't see the hole until it was too late. The rotted wood gave way with a sickening crack, and she was falling, the darkness rushing up to meet her, the screams of the dead finally finding a voice in the wind whistling past her ears. She hit the bottom with a bone-jarring thud, the world exploding into a kaleidoscope of pain before fading to black. When she woke, the first thing she felt was the cold. It was a deep, invasive chill that seemed to have settled in her marrow. Rain was falling. No, it was a deluge. Above her, a narrow slit of sky was visible, a bruised purple against the black rock. The storm had broken, and the mountain was weeping. Water cascaded down the walls of the shaft, turning the floor into a rising pool of mud and grit. She tried to move, but a white-hot spike of agony shot through her leg. Her right foot was pinned beneath a massive slab of limestone that had shifted during her fall. She was trapped in a stone vise, and the water was already at her waist. "My help," she croaked, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the rain. From the top of the shaft, a silhouette appeared against the lightning-streaked sky. Silas Varney. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a demon carved from the mountain itself. He looked down at her, his face illuminated by a flash of white light. "You should have stayed in the city, Lana," he shouted over the thunder. He kicked a large rock over the edge. It whistled past her, smashing into the water and spraying her with icy silt. Then came the construction debris, chunks of concrete, twisted rebar, old tires. He was filling the hole. He was finishing what his father had started 50 years ago. Lana screamed as a heavy timber crashed down, narrowly missing her head. She scrambled, her fingers clawing at the slick walls, but the stone slab wouldn't budge. She was going to drown in the dark, buried under the trash of the man who had killed her family. She reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the old watch. The metal felt different now, vibrant, almost warm. She jammed the heavy silver casing into the gap between the limestone slabs, using it as a desperate makeshift lever. She threw her entire weight against it, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The water reached her chin. She tilted her head back, gasping for the last few inches of air. Crack! The watch shattered, but the stone shifted just enough. She yanked her foot free, the skin tearing, and lunged for a narrow crevice in the wall just as the shaft above her collapsed in a roar of mud and debris. She burst through the surface like a ghost rising from the grave, her lungs heaving, her body coated in a thick layer of black coal dust and blood. Below her, in the valley, the lights of Varney's heavy machinery flickered. He was still there, moving the earth, trying to erase her. Lana didn't run away. She walked down the slope, her gait unsteady but her eyes fixed. She reached the perimeter of the site just as the massive excavators were positioning themselves to level the ridge. She stepped into the glare of the prompters, a terrifying, mud-caked apparition. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the mechanical roar. The machines ground to a halt. Men climbed out of their cabs, their faces pale as they looked at the woman who had seemingly crawled out of the solid rock. Silas Varney pushed through the crowd, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and fury. "You're dead," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not yet," Lana said. She held up the ledgers, the pages wet but the ink still legible. She began to read. She read the names. She read the orders. She read the cost of the lives buried beneath their feet. The workers, men who had grown up in the shadow of the Varney name, began to murmur. They looked at the papers, then at the mountain, then at the man they had feared their whole lives. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone. When the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot, its blue and red lights reflecting in the puddles, Lana didn't move. She watched as the metal cuffs were cinched around Varney's wrists. She watched as he was led away, his head finally bowed. But there was no triumph. A week later, the final letter from the university arrived. Her career was over. The unauthorized activities and the legal complications had made her radioactive in the world of academia. She sat on the porch of her grandfather's old cabin, the deed bought with the last of her savings resting on her lap. The mountains were quiet now. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep, peaceful silence that felt like a long overdue breath. She looked out at the tree line, where her new modest sensors were huming quietly in the dark. The bats were back, their tiny, high-pitched pulses invisible to the human ear, but clear on her monitors. She was alone, an outcast in the eyes of the world she had fought to join. But as she looked at the broken silver watch on the table beside her, she realized she wasn't a biologist anymore. She was the keeper of the hollow. She was home. And for the first time in her life, the McCoy name felt like a blessing, not a curse.